Hello, this is the second part of a video where I'm talking about how can you come up with some non-diatonic passing chords. So again, non-diatonic just means that they're chords that have accidentals in them when you think about the key that you're in. And in the first video we said a good way to do this is just take a simple arrangement of a song. We took Amazing Grace, we'll pull it back up here in a second, and then replace the resolutions that are there by resolutions that have stronger motion in the individual lines. So the strongest motion is if you go by a half step, and then after that is common tone, so something not moving at all. The weakest in a chord resolution anyway is if you move by a whole step. And so we tried, let's replace these whole step resolutions by half steps, and same thing, replace common tones by half steps. See if we can get something that sounds better. And just as a quick, let's do the first one just for example. So 1 going to 4, so like G going to C, so that's a half step. The G is not moving, so that's fine. The weakest part is the D going to E. And so the first thing we tried, hey, replace this D with either a D sharp or an F. So we get the options G augmented going to C or G7 going to C. And we liked both those, so we put those in our list. Hey, we like 1 augmented to 7 and also 1 7, or sorry, 1 augmented going to 4 and also 1 7 going to 4. And then we just kind of went through all the permutations. We wrote down the ones we liked, and we wrote down the ones that we also liked, but not really for this song in particular. And by doing that, we built our own little music theory catalog that we can pull from later. In this video, I want to show that we really discovered a bunch of things from a music theory course that are a little bit more advanced. So we discovered secondary dominants, mediant substitutions, tritones, borrowed chords, German augmented 6. We didn't actually do it in here, but the idea behind altered dominant chords is the exact same thing as what we were doing in that other video. And so I want to show you that just with this really simple trick, we actually discovered a lot of more advanced music theory. Okay. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and move this guy over so we can see Amazing Grace again. Don't know that it really matters which one I look at, but let's look at all these substitutions we came up with. So first the 1 7 to 4. So we originally had G going to C. We changed it to G7 going to C. Okay, that is prime example of what's called a secondary dominant. So secondary dominance says that if you forget about the context, if we forget that we're in the key of G, and I just walked up to the piano and played the two chords G7 to C, what does that sound like? Well, it sounds like 5 going to 1, right? So when you hear something that locally sounds like a 5-1, even if it's in the wrong key or whatever, that's what we call a secondary dominant. I mean, the dominant resolution or the perfect cadence, whichever way you want to call it, would be the 5 of our key going to the 1 of our key. But if we play anything that looks like a 5-1, we still think about it as being a dominant resolution, but it's not going to the G, which is our home base in this song, and so we call it a secondary dominant. The most common form of a secondary dominant is that one where you actually use the dominant 7 chord, but you can actually use any version of 5 going to 1, so I could just go G to C. You could think about that as being a secondary dominant too. Or you have our second option, which is an augmented chord going to 1. Also sounds like a 5-1 resolution. So if I go back to the original key I was in, so D going to G is my 5-1. If I wanted to spice it up, I could make it a D7. Or if I wanted to spice it up, I could also make it D augmented. So it's not as normal of a choice, but that's another perfectly good 5-1 resolution. And so that augmented G going to C is kind of just another type of secondary dominant. Okay. Next we did B minor going to C. So if I change this G to a B minor, what happened to the root of my chord? Well, the root was G and it moved up to B. G to B is a third. That's what the word mediant means, is movement by a third. So if I change the root of a chord by a third, the chord really doesn't change very much. So G, and then A minor, and then B minor. This B minor is almost the same chord as the G I started on. The only difference is now I have an F sharp instead of before I had a G. It would also work if I went the other way. So if I started at G and went down, this E minor is almost the same chord as the G I started with. The E minor has an E in it, and the G had a D in it. So if you move by a third, the chord you land on has two notes in common with the chord you started with, and so functionally it's going to act very similar when you do a chord resolution with it. So that's the mediant part. And then the diatonic, again, diatonic just means we're staying in the key. So instead of playing B major or some other B, we're playing, so we don't have any accidentals. So we're sticking with just the notes that are in the key of G. Okay. And then that leads us to the next choice, which was the chromatic mediant substitution. So we still changed this G to a B, but instead of changing it to B minor, we changed it to B major. So we went B major, C. So if I played it in the song, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Yeah. So that sounds really nice too, and then that chromatic note makes it a lot more interesting. But that's another example of a mediant substitution, but because I'm playing accidentals in that chord that's a third away, it makes it a chromatic mediant substitution. We actually see another example of that at the bottom. We're going to call it a German augmented 6. We're also going to call it a tritone substitution of the secondary dominant, but one of our options at the bottom, going from G to D, was to change this D, G to an E flat. You can think about that as being a chromatic mediant substitution, even though it's a little crazier because the chromatic is in the root of the chord. I mean, normally you would think G going down to E, so some form of E going to C. E major going to C or something, but here we're going to D, right? So like an E major going to D or something. But here we change that E itself to an E flat. So it's a little more extreme of a chromatic mediant substitution, but you could think about it that way. All right. The next one is one that we actually kind of rejected for Amazing Grace itself, but we put down that we liked it. It was this flat 7 diminished going to 4. So flat 7 diminished is F diminished going to C. And I wanted to cover this one because it's a really important substitution, especially in jazz. It's called a tritone substitution. So let's go back to that 5-1 idea. So the G7 going to C. Where's most of the harmonic content in that resolution? Most of it's in the B and the F. So B to F, that interval is called a tritone. It's resolving to C and E. So the idea of a tritone substitution is you take any other chord that has that same BF tritone in it and have it resolve to C. So one example would be F diminished, right? F diminished resolving to C. It's got that same BF tritone and it's resolving the same way, resolving to E and C. So that's a tritone substitution. If you want to know what the tritone substitution is, if it's not otherwise specified, usually the tritone substitution is not just take any chord that has that BF in it, but take the other dominant 7 chord that has that BF in it. So any tritone shows up in 2 dominant 7 chords. So that BF is in a G7 chord, but it's also in a C sharp 7 chord. So that's like the tritone substitution. And actually that's basically what we had when we did that F diminished. So in more modern harmonies, diminished chords can show up in lots of places like octatonic harmonies and things like that. But in more classical harmony, usually when you see a diminished chord, you think about that as being a dominant 7 chord that you're not playing the root on. So if I play this F diminished chord, it's kind of implied that really the root is C sharp. I'm just not playing that C sharp. And so if you think about it that way, that's exactly the tritone substitution. It's the C sharp 7 to C. Right. By the way, the way you can figure out what the other dominant 7 chord is that has the same tritone is just to move the non-tritone voices by a tritone. It's like there's tritones everywhere, right? So G7, if I move that G by a tritone, I get the C sharp. So that tells me the root of my tritone substitution is C sharp. Same thing, the D, if I move that by a tritone, is a G sharp. So the fifth of my tritone substitution is going to be the G sharp. So that's how you can figure that if you don't want to run down all the possibilities. You just think, okay, what's a tritone away from G? It's a C sharp, so C sharp 7. Alright, so that's the 1/4s we came up with. We also come up with a lot of 1/5s. The first one was to go 1 minor to 5. And there's a couple ways we can think about this. Probably the easiest, most natural one is the idea of a borrowed chord, which is, it's kind of like so G is our home base. We're in the key of G major. But there's lots of other G scales besides G major. Most importantly is G minor. And as you know, major songs tend to sound more happy, minor songs tend to sound more sad. And so if I temporarily stay in G as my home base, but switch from G to G minor, I can put a kind of a sad emotional effect in there. So this was on the 1/5. We wound up doing the A9, but if we'd went with the G minor instead, so G minor, we would have a sound like this. That saved a wretch like me. So it's like I'm happy because I'm saved, and then I'm sad because I think about where I was, and then I'm content again because I'm saved. So that's one way to think about it, is like just for one measure I'm kind of changing keys from G into G minor just to get that emotional effect that I want to get across with the word wretch. The other way you can think about it is it's kind of like the minor plagal cadence. So going back to the 5-1, 5-1 is called the perfect cadence. On the other hand, the 4-1, so if I go from G to D, that's called the plagal cadence. It's a nice resolution, but it's not as impactful maybe as the perfect cadence is. You hear it a lot in rock and roll though, or pop and other places, because chord loops really like going from 4 to 1. But anyway, so there's the regular plagal cadence. The minor plagal cadence is just to change that 4 to a 4 minor. You hear this a lot in really nostalgic songs. So like if I go, I'm happy about life, and I'm happy with where I am, but then I think about my life and decide I'm still happy. Something like that. So you could also think about that like out of context as being a minor plagal cadence. Okay. Next up we had that 2-9 going to 5, so that A9 going to D. Again, that's just another secondary dominant, because if I think about the key of D, then A9 going to D is a 5 to 1. So this is just, if I forget that I'm in the key of G and think about those two chords, it looks like 5-1, so that's a secondary dominant. Lastly, we're going to get a little bit more out there now. Talking about this last one, I'm not really going to look at so the one augmented going to 5 is kind of an alternate form of the flat 6-7 going to a 5. There's a couple ways you could think about this. You could think about this as being a tritone substitution of the secondary dominant. So let's break that apart real quick. So we're going to D. If we did a secondary dominant, then we proceed it by doing a A7, right? So A7 to D would be a regular secondary dominant. Well, what if I wanted to tritone substitute this A? So the tritone is C sharp and G. If I move the A itself by a tritone, that's the E flat, and then move the E by a tritone, that's the B flat. So the tritone substitution for this A7 is a E flat 7. So I could think about this E flat 7 to D as being a tritone substituted the secondary dominant. But there's a different way I can think about this, which actually I already changed it in my notes. I didn't mean to. So we changed this to a E flat 7. What it was originally was an E minor. And as we were going through that video, we said real quick, well, E minor is basically the same chord as G, right? Which, in retrospect, we just said that, but what we were really using at the time was that diatonic media substitution, right? Because if I take an E minor and move up by a third, it's a G, right? So E minor and G are very close to the same chord. But I could also think about this E minor as being almost the same chord as C. And that's where the second way to think about this E flat 6, this E flat 7 chord comes in. So let's talk real quick where the German augmented 6 comes from. So first of all, what's the difference between an augmented 6th and a dominant 7? So E flat to D flat. We normally think of that as being a flat 7, but you can also think about it as being, from E flat to C is a major 6th, so E flat to C sharp is a sharp 6 or augmented 6th. And that kind of leads to the question, go back to very beginning of your playing, is C sharp and D flat the same note? Well, kind of. I mean, they're the same pitch, right? They're both right there. But as you go on and learn some more about music theory, you find out, well, even though they're the same pitch, when you start using them in harmony and stuff, they act differently. Namely, a C sharp is usually going to want to resolve up to a D, whereas a D flat is usually going to resolve down to a C. And if we just think about it in the abstract, the chord E flat 7, how does we expect that to resolve? Well, we expect that 7 to resolve down and give us a A flat chord. But that's not what's happening here. Here that C sharp is resolving up to give us the D chord. So we should really, I mean, you can definitely make the argument that this D flat in this E flat 7 chord is actually not a D flat at all. It's actually a C sharp. And so this is actually E flat with a sharp 6 in it, aka a E sharp. Wow, it's hard to even say this. An E flat augmented 6th. Okay. So that's one way to think about it. That's one reason the term augmented 6 gets in there. Of course, if you unpack that, by that logic, any tritone substitution you could think of as an augmented 6th. And if I go back to the first one, so G going to C, we changed it to C sharp 7 going to C. Again, I've got this flat 7 resolving up, so maybe it's not a flat 7, maybe it's a sharp 6. So I'll let you go down that rabbit hole yourself. So are all tritone substitutions actually augmented 6 chords instead of flat 7 chords? But this one in particular has a really good reason to call it an augmented 6th, which is when I thought about this E minor as being a variant of C instead of a variant of G. So if I thought about it as being the tritone substitution, really the chord I'm starting with here is an A, right? I'm doing a secondary dominant to D. So once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. That sounds okay, but that kind of sounds hokey. I mean, especially you compare it to putting the C there. I was lost, but now found. Was blind, but now I see. So, I mean, if we can view this E flat chord as being a variant of C, that kind of sounds more natural than viewing this E flat chord as being a variant of A, because A sounded a little hokey when I put it right there, but the C sounds pretty okay. So how is this E flat a variant of C instead? Well, just for a moment, let me take out the 4 and go straight to 1. So 4-5-1, of course, is a very common resolution. So 4, or in this context, I guess it's going to be, so this is the 4-5-1 where the idea of the German augmented 6 comes from. So let's look at the voice leading on this. You've got the C going up to D, and then the D stays the same, right? And then the E is going up to the F, and then going up to the G. So that's got one half step motion and one whole step motion. The G is going up to D, and then up to B, and So it's doing all whole steps. And then the top voice is going up by a whole step, and then it's staying put. So there's a lot of whole step motions in that resolution. And so the idea of the German augmented sixth was, well, let's change this fourth chord and make those resolutions a little tighter. So we're going to do the same trick we've been doing. Instead of going from C to D, I'm going to change that C to a C sharp. That sounds a lot better, right? But we still got this E moving by a whole step. So to get around that, we're actually going to, and the G is also moving by a whole step. So what we're going to do to get around that is we're going to cover this F sharp. Instead of moving the E up to F sharp, we're going to move the G down to F sharp. So let's leave the E out for a second. So we're going to go. So now we've got lots of half step motion, so that's already good. What should we do with the E? Well, we can have it double up moving to the D if we change the E to an E flat. So the idea of what we're doing with the C chord, we're changing the C to a C sharp, but changing the E to an E flat. So it becomes, this is our altered C chord, which is, lo and behold, an E flat 7 or E flat with a sharp 6. So that's where the augmented sixth comes from. And then if you fill out some of the middle harmonies, so instead of just, right now there's nothing resolving to the A and the D chord. So the German augmented sixth is the variant where you put a B flat in that augmented sixth chord. That way it can walk down to the A. So anyway, that was a pretty good little, yeah, we walked a little bit of a path there. But the point being is that the augmented sixth and that tritone substitution of the dominant or whatever is, I mean, in some sense they're the same resolution because you've got the exact same notes being played. Every note is resolving exactly the same way. But it's still important to think about both ways because they're substitutions of different other options. I mean, again, if I did that if I think about this as being a tritone substitution of a secondary dominant, then I'm thinking about this as being an alteration of A7. And so I'm thinking about, well, I'm starting with now I'm found 'twas blind, but now I see. I mean, that's one approach, but if I think about it as being the augmented sixth, then what I'm doing, I'm starting with the C chord instead of the A chord. So now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. So sometimes it is instructive to think about the same resolution in two different ways because those two different ways since they come from two different places, it gives you a little extra insight on what else you could have done. I mean, I could go back and instead of thinking about this as being a 5-1 now, I could think about it as being a 4-5. Or sorry, instead of a 1-5, think about it as a 4-5. I could do my same tricks with this C chord and see what I come up with. I could discover some more music theory. Okay. Alright, so that was a bit of an adventure. Let me just say real quick, the last thing is, especially in jazz, you have altered dominant chords. The idea of altered dominant chords is exactly the same thing as what we've been doing. So Here's G going to C. If I try to alter the G chord, usually what that means is, well, I keep the G7, but I change the 5 either to a flat or a sharp 5. And if you just listen to those chords by themselves, they aren't very satisfying. But they're not supposed to be played by themselves. They're supposed to resolve to the 1. So if I resolve the flat 5 to the 1, that sounds pretty good. Or I really like the sharp 5 in that context, as opposed to, I mean, this sounds okay, but you compare it to me, that has a whole lot of drive to it, and then that has a little bit of a different pull, but still very nice. What's the idea behind those? Well, if you look at where everything's resolving, the G's not moving, so that's okay. The F's moving to E, that's a half step. The B's moving to C, that's a half step. So that much of it's really strong. The only question is this D. Honestly, it's not really even clear where it's going, right? I mean, if you had somebody singing this D, he's either going to double up with the F guy going to E, or he's going to double up with the B guy going to C. I mean, you really can't hear the D moving anywhere in particular when I do that resolution. And so the idea is, well, let's pick which one it's going to resolve to and move it where it's only half step. So if we want the D to resolve to an E, let's change the D and make it a D sharp. Now you can definitely hear that D sharp to E resolution. Same thing if we decide we want the guy singing D to resolve to C instead. Well, instead of having him sing a D, let's have him sing a C sharp. So that's, and again, you can really hear that C sharp resolving down to C. So anyway, again, the whole goal of this video, I just wanted to show you how much music theory, especially harmonic music theory, I mean, melodic music theory is a whole other story, but a whole bunch of harmonic music theory really is just this idea of altering chord resolutions by changing whole steps to half steps, maybe changing common tones to half steps. I mean, it's a really simple idea, but you see just how much of music theory comes out of this one really simple idea. So, hope you enjoyed that.